Somewhere in East Africa, there's a fire that's been passed from hand to hand for so long that no one alive remembers who started it. Not because they couldn't, because they never had to. Making fire was never the hardest part. Ancient humans figured out sparks and friction surprisingly early, but that skill alone wouldn't have kept anyone alive. The real challenge was keeping a fire alive through 100 straight days of rain, because once a fire dies in the wet season, it doesn't just come back. Somewhere in our past, entire seasons looked like this. A thick forest canopy, soaked ground, rain that didn't fall and stop. It just hung in the air for weeks. This wasn't a rare disaster. It was ordinary life for early humans living in the tropical and monsoon regions of Africa and Southeast Asia. And in that world, cold wasn't the real killer. Wet was. Here's something most people never think about. A wet body loses heat dramatically faster than a dry one, even in exactly the same air temperature. That's not a small difference. That's the difference between an uncomfortable night and a fatal one. So a family without fire during monsoon season wasn't facing one bad night. No warmth. No way to dry out. No way to preserve food. No real barrier against whatever hunted in the dark. That's a slow collapse, not a single bad night. Which raises the real question. Who solved this? Not the genius who invented the spark. The person, or the system, that made sure the fire never went out in the first place. We love the image of a caveman striking two rocks together in one brilliant moment of discovery. It's a satisfying story. It's also almost beside the point. Anthropologists studying isolated communities during the 19th and 20th centuries, including certain island populations in the Andaman Sea, documented something that sounds almost backwards. Some people had no way at all to start a fire from scratch, and they didn't need one. Their fire hadn't gone out in living memory, not in their lifetime, not in their parents' lifetime. Think about that for a second. One unbroken flame, carefully tended and passed along for generations, because losing it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was closer to losing a language, or a skill, or the only food source your group depended on, something you couldn't simply recreate whenever you wanted. So the real ancient technology wasn't ignition, it was continuity. And continuity turned out to be far harder than creating a spark. This isn't just a theory. Walk into Wonderwork Cave in South Africa today, about 30 meters from the entrance, deep enough that no lightning strike or wildfire could ever reach it. Archaeologists found a layer of ash mixed with burned bone and charred plant material. The exact same spot was used again and again, across an enormous stretch of time. Some dating now places that layer at well over 1 million years old. That's the clue. A hearth reused for generations isn't evidence of people who were good at starting fires. It's evidence of people who were good at never losing them. And it wasn't just South Africa, China, the Middle East. The same pattern appears again and again. The same hearths, reused across generations. Try keeping a campfire alive overnight and you'll discover the obvious problem. Leave it alone, and it either burns out or burns through all your fuel. Now imagine stretching that problem across 100 rainy nights in a row. No matches, no lighter, and rain that never seems to stop. Ancient firekeepers solved it with two techniques, and both are smarter than they sound. The first was called banking. Instead of keeping a bright flame burning all night, they let it settle into a bed of glowing coals. Then they buried those coals beneath a carefully measured layer of ash and dirt. Too little, and the coals died from exposure. Too much, and they suffocated from lack of oxygen. There was only a narrow window between the two. Miss it, and you were back to absolute zero. In the middle of a monsoon, that could mean never getting the fire back at all. The second technique was choosing the right material. Not every dry stick can bring a dying coal back to life. Certain slow-burning fungi, especially a bracket fungus called Fomes fomentarius, can hold a glowing ember for hours without producing an open flame, almost like a natural slow-burning fuse. Groups that knew which bark, which fungus, and which dead wood stayed ready to smolder, even after days of rain, had a huge advantage over groups that didn't. None of this was one great invention. It was an unwritten craft, tested through failure, refined generation after generation by the people who survived the worst seasons and remembered exactly what worked. And here's the part that changes everything. This wasn't a one-time skill. It was a full-time job. Every single day, someone in the group had one responsibility. Don't let it die. This is worth pausing on because it tells us something about how these groups were organized. Fire tending wasn't glamorous, and it probably wasn't assigned to the strongest hunter or the oldest elder. Anthropologists studying traditional societies, including hunter-gatherer groups in southern Africa and Aboriginal communities in Australia, have documented fire tending as a role often given to children or elders, not because it was easy, but because it required constant attention instead of bursts of physical strength. In other words, one of humanity's earliest specialized jobs may not have been hunting or tool making. It may have been quietly sitting beside a bed of glowing coals at 3 o'clock in the morning, making sure they were still alive. Picture a child, maybe 10 years old, sitting alone beside the fire. Rain hissing just outside the shelter. Everyone else is asleep, their entire responsibility to the group is that small orange glow in front of them. We know this system sometimes failed because we can see it in the archaeological record. Some groups show clear signs of losing fire mastery for long periods, before learning it again later. Sometimes from neighboring groups. Losing a fire line wasn't a minor setback. It meant eating cold food. It meant losing one of the best defenses against predators at night. It meant having no reliable way to dry clothing or equipment during the exact season when everything around you stayed soaked. And this is where the story stops being about physics and starts becoming about people. Because a smart group didn't just protect one fire. They protected access to fire. That meant staying close enough to neighboring groups that, if disaster struck, they could borrow an ember. Think of it as one of humanity's earliest systems of shared responsibility. Having someone awake through the night wasn't just another chore. It was a role trusted to one person, for the benefit of everyone else sleeping nearby. And it probably went even further. Imagine a single glowing coal, carefully wrapped and carried through heavy rain from one camp to another. A group with a dead fire had very few choices left. Ask, trade, or barter for someone else's ember. That single need, please don't let your fire die before I reach you, may have been one of the earliest reasons unrelated human groups ever chose to cooperate. You can still see echoes of that instinct today. The Olympic torch relay, a flame carried by hand from city to city, never allowed to go out before the games begin. Zoroastrian fire temples have kept certain flames burning continuously for centuries. And in ancient Rome, the Vestal Virgins had one responsibility: keep the sacred fire alive. Failing meant death. None of these traditions are coincidences. They're cultural memories of a survival problem that was once deadly serious. There's another reason fire still feels comforting today. A researcher at the University of Alabama measured what happens when people watch a real fire. He checked their blood pressure before and after. It dropped. And the longer people watched the flames, the greater the drop became. That's not just a feeling. It's a measurable effect. And that reaction probably isn't random. For hundreds of thousands of years, the sight of a healthy, carefully tended fire meant one simple thing: tonight, we're safe. The people who felt calm around fire, instead of constantly fearing its loss, were the ones who could rest, think clearly, and function the next day. That feeling of calm may be something you inherited. So picture that scene one last time. The fire fading, the rain refusing to stop. The people who survived those nights, across hundreds of generations, weren't the ones who could strike a spark whenever they wanted. They were the ones who never let the coal go out. The next time you flick a lighter without thinking, remember this. For most of human history, that flame wasn't a convenience, it was an inheritance, protected every single night by someone, so that one day you could take it for granted. If this changed the way you see something as ordinary as fire, there are thousands more everyday things hiding stories just like this. Subscribe, and let's uncover them together.